Please come take the stage, Marie.
Can I invite you all to actually just close your eyes for a minute?
Please come take the stage, Marie.
Can I invite you all to actually just close your eyes for a minute? Sitting in a darkened room with the outline of children's toys and hospital strip lighting creeping in, I'm sat next to my nan in complete silence. I find the silence deafening as I'm used to noise and decide I need to go and find him. I need to make sure he's okay, or in my 9-year-old mind, I need to check he doesn't need saving. I find him, and he's stretched out with his face down and has a giant needle going into his spine. The only thing I remember after that are his eyes, as they were so wide I thought they might actually explode. I don't know if this memory is completely factual, or if it's just the parts my memory has pieced together. But the one thing I'll never forget are his eyes. You just don't forget pain like that. So when I saw them again 15 years later, except this time they were the eyes of his mother, I knew something tragic had happened. You can all now open your eyes again. That was me reminding you of a memory of my brother when he'd contracted meningitis at the age of 14. And he'd been ill for about 2 weeks. And even though my mother kept telling the hospital that she thought it was actually meningitis, and they thought it was flu, it was, in fact, meningitis. And it ended up him being hospitalised and with fluid on his spine, and he had to have a lumbar puncture in which to remove it. And this basically triggered the beginning of a journey that I didn't know that I was about to embark on, which he didn't know he was going to embark on, which then triggered a disease that he had that had been dormant until that time, called mixed connective tissue disease, which is a form of lupus, which is an autoimmune disease. And so his body started attacking himself. And at the age of 16, his kidneys had failed, and he was having dialysis. He had his first transplant at the age of 18 on his 18th birthday, and he had his second one around his 21st. And at 26, I gave him his third one. That's my brother and that's my mother, and I think they both have the most beautiful eyes. And essentially this is about my finding my way home, because 10 years ago, last Sunday, just gone, my brother passed away. And that was 3 years after I gave him the kidney. And it was the catalyst for me to live a life that I don't think I would have potentially if that hadn't have actually happened. He was 6.5 years older than me, and it's quite funny because most people often assumed that I was the older sibling just because of the way I would behave. Incredibly bossy. And I think my mum always tells this anecdote of when I was, I think, about a year old, and I once thought that some friends of his were bullying him, but in fact they were actually just playing. And I was sat there and had my wooden blocks and I threw it at his head. It was actually meant to get his friends, but poor aim at that age. I grew up in a home with unwavering love, self-belief and determination. And that comes from my parents. And they created an environment for us to feel enriched, to feel important, and to feel heard, which are all things that have fed into the work I do now. And that led me on a journey in which to feel fearless about donating a kidney to my brother. I came home, I think I was 20 years old. It was my first year of university. And by this point, the second kidney never really took very well. And I came home at Easter and saw my brother essentially dying. And I kind of always had a feeling within me that I wanted to try and save him, which is what I mentioned at the beginning. And this was my opportunity to try and see if I could do that for him. Because he'd already had the 2 operations, he had a 5% chance of ever being able to get a kidney that matched. So the likelihood, even though we were siblings, was quite low. Yet still, after 6 months of testing, I was. And I think this is probably one of the only times I've ever saw my brother cry. And it was when they were taking me to the operating room. And I can hear his flip-flops running down the hallway because they hadn't told him that I was on the way. And he literally stood there and he just said, "Thank you." And I think those words, as the most powerful words, if they really come from a place of actual thanks. And even with knowing what happened 10 years ago, if I could go back and do that all again, I would, because it gave him the 3 best years of his life since he was 14. This is a quote. I've recently been reading a book by Janet Mock, and it's called Redefining Realness. And when my brother passed away, I wasn't happy. And it took probably about 3 years worth of therapy to basically summarize that he was a person that was the most important person to me in the world. And with him, physically and metaphorically, a part of me died. So while reading this book, a lot of this has been coming to me, and it kind of set me on the path that I'm essentially on now. I had the pleasure of working with a beautiful family by the name of the Blaneys. Amanda actually spoke here last year. And I had been doing various different things because I'm someone that I like change. I like to mix things up. And I realised I wasn't happy and I wanted to do something for myself. Working for the Blaneys was a wonderful opportunity for me to actually take time out and think about what was important to me and how I wanted to live my life. And it was such a beautiful, safe space in which I was taught how to manage someone's beautiful sensitivity in their son, Reuben. I was taught how to parent by their beautiful daughter, Pearl. And I was taught how to love myself from their beautiful daughter, Rose. Her hugs are wholly so healing, and that stems from their parents. And Michael is someone who has taught me how to understand the need to be with someone who enriches your life. And Amanda just taught me how to believe in myself. And one of the most funny things is, though I was their nanny, I was actually, in our interview was just about food. And that's kind of now how we get to the food part of what I'm talking about. And I decided to start a supper club. It'll be 4 years ago in September. And it was a way for me to be able to go back to my roots, essentially, and understand my cultural heritage. Growing up in Britain, you don't really hear enough about the contribution that Black, African and Caribbean immigrants have actually made. And so this is my investigation in which to be able to understand that and to share that with the world. And it's a way of rerouting British Caribbean culture in the UK. So I started Pop's Kitchen 4 years ago in September, and it was initially started with my parents. My dad helped me cook. My beautiful mum, as you can tell, loves to host. She is probably one of the most outrageous flirts I've ever met in my life. And this was probably the way in which we were able to reroute and redefine our family again. And for the first time, we kind of felt like a family again, because for quite a while, I think, particularly my dad, actually, I think he was unable to express the fact that he had lost his partner in crime. And I think that's how we all felt. I struggled immensely, and I think a lot of that stemmed from the fact that I was scared because I'd always had a brother, I'd always had a sibling, I'd always had an ally, and suddenly I became very aware of mortality, and in a way in which then made me feel like I was alone. So starting this business really gave me the opportunity again to unite my family and to be able to start working on the things I wanted to. Nearly a year in, I met my business partner of the business I now run, called Island Social Club, and this is just a little introduction to it.
London is the place for me. London, this lovely city. You can go to France or America, India, Asia or Australia, but you must come back to London City.
Now, when it comes to Instagram, I'm a bit of a stalker. And that's basically how I met my business partner, Joseph. Whenever anyone used to follow me on Pop's Kitchen, I would always check out who they were. And I remember seeing this thing pop up called Everybody's Rum Shop. I was like, who are they? So I sent a message and said, I'd love to know a bit more, because it was all very elusive, which I now understand is his MO. And he explained they run a rum pop-up, and he'd noticed me and would be great to collaborate. So that's the first supper club that we ever did together, and I almost killed him. I didn't sleep for 2 days because every day he kept saying another person wants to come, so I ended up cooking for 70 people in a kitchen I'd never cooked in before, of which none of the equipment was there when we actually showed up. So that was interesting, but it was the birth of Island Social Club, which both Joe and I is our journey of understanding what it means to be British Caribbean. And we are both second generation immigrants, and it's a way in which we are able to move the conversation on from what people kind of experience as Caribbean. Now, both my parents are originally from Jamaica, but actually there's so much more to the Caribbean than jerk. And even though jerk is actually one of the most beautiful things and really is an amalgamation of the 4 different continents that essentially came together in the Caribbean, it's our way of being able to explore this. We have been incredibly lucky to recently start a residency, our first permanent residency this year, of which we've already featured in The Guardian, ES Magazine, Munchies, and what I'm basically trying to get to now is that, oh no, bear with me a moment, I'm horrendous with technology. Thank you, Hugh. Sorry. Yeah, thank you. For me, my brother passing away was wholeheartedly the hardest thing I've ever dealt with. But what it taught me is that it's so important to understand that home is actually part of you. And I have been on a journey in which, in losing him, I actually gained so much more. And it took a long time for me to understand that. And his anniversary on Sunday was probably the first anniversary in the 10 years that I haven't cried. And I think that was because I woke up in the morning and decided to look on his Facebook profile that we still have active and read the conversations that we used to have. And it reminded me that the reason why I decided to get into food is because it's about having conversations. It's about understanding that through food and breaking bread, you actually are able to engage with people, and you can broach subjects that are hard and that are difficult. And it can lead you to places that you didn't know before. And essentially the food that's on your plate is a journey in itself. And having an appreciation and understanding of that is the way in which we can get towards coming home. Now, I'm thankful that in working for the Blaneys and in allowing myself to be as free as I wanted to with the work that I'm doing, I've found my way home. And I also then found the love of my life, who's hiding on the third row over there. and who every day teaches me and shows me that I can do whatever I want to do and gives me the space and the freedom in which to do that. We won't do it again. And it's just, essentially, this is just my way of saying that I think food is just a vehicle, and one that we should respect and understand and love, because it's more than just food. And it was the way in which I found my way home, and the way in which it taught me to understand that actually I am my own home, and wherever I go, I can make my home. And yeah.
I am my own home. What a beautiful way to bring that home. It's so beautifully told. We had the pleasure a few years ago of a great food writer, Anna Jones, sharing her thoughts with us. And Anna talked about the way that every bite of food that we eat is a vote for the kind of world that we want to create. And that kind of really understanding the food, but also the value it brings around conversation and how much we take it for granted. So thank you for sharing that. And the other thing, I guess, that we easily take for granted is, particularly in Wales, I mean, David, way back in Howie's days, had this T-shirt made. There's no Howie's T-shirt. It was kind of rain in winter. It was like going this way, and rain in summer comes this way. And it's kind of, people have this perception that it's always raining in Wales, which is not quite true. But we take the water stuff for granted. We take so much of this stuff for granted. We take our food for granted, we take our soils, and we take our water for granted and assume it's always going to be there for everyone. And as David, our next speaker, knows more than most, we're nowhere near in that space of taking this stuff for granted. So many of you be aware of the challenges that are going on, like right now in Chennai. How many cities of over 10 million people have already kind of we're mining our water to crazy levels. David's been working for decades on how to fix those problems. Is going to tell us some of the challenges and the solutions to do this in a different way. So with a huge welcome for our next speaker, David, come take the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Many years ago, my mother at one of my drinks parties took a friend aside and said, "Oh, I wish one of my children would have a book published." She had different priorities from most mothers. 9 years ago, I did a lecture on water, and afterwards we had a writer's retreat with other friends. And I was trying to work on a novel which I've been working on since 1994, which I'm still working on, but that's another story. But instead, they said, forget your novel. You're telling great stories about water. Write a book. And so I did, and it was a worst seller. But it was a fascinating journey because people about water. I've always loved painting with words. That's the best way I can express it. The problem has been acquiring honesty. I look back at that first book. The language is over-elaborate, it's flowery, it's evasive. I'm running away from things. I wasn't prepared to address things. I've learnt the hard way about honesty. There's honesty in writing. It's not easy. It's easy to overwrite. It's easy to over-elaborate. Paring back to the honest core is hard. That's where the work is. Then there's honesty in business. I was once told by a chap that I would never become a business leader for a very simple reason. I'm just too honest. Take me to a conference, and I'm afraid my bullshit detector comes on immediately. So, for example, there was one talking about water policy, where we had this nice lady from the Scottish government saying that they had worked out the cost of complying with some European legislation to 0.1%. So me, I get up and say, well, the only problem is the Scottish Parliament's cost 10 times its budgeted amount. So how can you do something to 0.1%? I'm sorry, I don't believe in your bullshit. And that goes down like a bucket of sick. The problem is actually, though, we We're always one step away from working in a shitocracy, as I would call it. What is a shitocracy? It's a culture which rewards people for being shits. It's a culture where people have to be seen to be rewarded as shits. And the problem is, someone once said to me, why do you keep falling out with people? Why do you have enemies? And I said, because I can't suffer shits anymore. You get the sort of person who thinks it's cool. We were visiting a firm of lawyers, and it's called Denton Wild Sapter. And my colleague was in a lift with a woman in her early 20s and said, hey, what's it like to work for Denton Wild Sex? I mean, that's very clever, isn't it? She felt shat upon. He felt good. He was a shit, and he was being rewarded for being a shit. I got out of this for two ways. First of all, I discovered something 21 years ago called love. I married into love. I married into a loving family. And that had transformed my life. It gave me an honesty and a reason to stop evading things, which had been cornerstone of my existence. Then I discovered about being honest with myself. And ultimately that was realized by realizing that there's no point in working full-time with other people. I've just got to go out on my own, run my own business, be myself. And for the last 16 years, I've done that. We live in a glorious house 10 miles away from here, overlooking Newcastle Emlyn, with people I want to be with people who I love. And that is a way of being creative. Work is a fascinating thing, though. Work is a people business. I used to work in the city, the old-fashioned city, before the Big Bang. And I've discovered that in the information industry, there are three types of people. There's the finder, the natural salesman, the chap or chapess who, whenever you're at a conference, he's out there shaking hands, handing out business cards. He just is addicted to meeting people. Then you have the connector, the person who loves to build relationships. And then finally, you have what I would call the honest drudge, the grinder, the maven, which is me, the one who actually does the job. And people don't understand how distinct, yet how interrelated these relationships are. A mate of mine, who recently retired as a senior partner in a city firm of lawyers, had not done a bit of legal work in 40 years, but nor was he meant to. His job was to go out and shake hands and bring business in for the grinders. I grind. I dredge out information for people. And I actually have to confess, I utterly, unrequitedly love it. Taking information from academic research, taking raw data, making it make sense to people, making the incomprehensible comprehensible. It got to the point where, discovering this thing called honesty, I found, last year I had an academic textbook published, and it was readable. This is actually quite a controversial subject, because the more readable an academic text is, the less people trust it. We want to be bemused. But there are actual oases of loquaciousness in this text. It's a strange thing. So subversive in a way. So I got into all this a long time ago. 40 years ago, a fellow undergraduate earnestly came up to me and said, David, for goodness sake, don't change your degree course. There's no future in ecology. So what did I do? I got that degree and I did a doctorate in applied ecology. And when job hunting was there, oh, you're overqualified. So we moved from a shitocracy to a cretinocracy. The dumber and dumber. Let's reward imbecilism, of course, which is exactly what we live in. I mean, Britain, America, it's a rush to the bottom. Who can have the greater imbecile running us? And by God, the competition is strong. So I have spent the last 30 years trying to make sense of water to people. I've learned one huge lesson in those 30 years, which is people are not going to change. No one, or far too people, are prepared to take water seriously. Now, 4 years ago, we had something called the Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainable Development Goal 6 is that by 2030, everyone in the world will have access to safe water and safe sanitation and indeed sewage treatment. Problem is, when reality rears its ugly head. So last week, we got the review of how things have gone in the first 2 years of this process. 1/3 of all countries in the world still don't even know how many people have access to safe water or safe sanitation. We are living in a world where information is an utter vacuum. How are we going to do something about this? Can we do something about this? Now, as in the spirit of the Do lectures, it's two things. One is your professional métier, the other one is the story. So my story is about smart, being smart. How water and the entire business of water and the delivery of water can be fundamentally, disruptively changed by smart thinking. As you can imagine, water is a conservative business. If your mobile phone loses your signal, it doesn't matter, it's a hassle. If brown stuff comes out of your tap, or even worse, up your loo, that's not a hassle, that is insufferable. Water utility simply cannot afford to make a mistake. As a result, the way we treat sewage today is almost identical to a process invented in 1913. We haven't moved very much on from 1804 for water treatment. The biggest innovation in water at the moment was perfected in 1989, 30 years for it to become commercial. I was at a conference discussing megatrends, the big things that affect water, and one of the speakers said, well, everything is out there already. We are not going to see any innovations which we don't know about before 2035. That sort of attitude is utterly corrosive because it means that we're stuck with what we have when in fact what we need is innovation and optimism. Everyone talks about water being scarce. It isn't. It's abundant. The entire world works as a single, colossal, vast desalination facility. Water comes up from the sea and it falls down onto our land pure. What we have a shortage of is money, management, and policy. But the water itself is abundant. As Lord Kelvin once said, what we cannot measure, we cannot manage. And that is the essence of water. We know so little about how we use it. So we have a passive attitude about the way we deal with our water. You get a leak. Oh, you deal with the leak when it becomes visible. But when it becomes visible, it might have already carved out a hole many, many cubic meters. You have lost millions of cubic meters of water. There are countries where 75% of the water they put into the pipes doesn't actually make it to the customer. That's where the shortage comes from. So, let's take another look. I'm going to work, and all of a sudden my mob flashes up, and it says, you have an unnatural or unusual amount of water being used last night. A, we've turned off your valve. B, we're getting someone to fix it. All of a sudden, we've moved into the world of smart water. We're living in real time. Because what has happened, you have a smart meter in your house, so instead of having your water measured, if at all, once or twice a year, it's being measured every 15 minutes, every 15 seconds. Every part of the network is being measured in real time. Pressure, leakage, 3 different ways of measuring leakage. So big bursts, little slurps, everything is being measured. We're living in a smart street. We're living in real time. Smart water is about gathering every bit of data we can, transmitting it somewhere, crunching the numbers, and presenting what managers and people need. It's also about a two-way street. Instead of us being passive users of water, we interact with the utility because we know what we're using, we know when we're using it, we know how we're using it. For example, a third of your electricity bill actually is water related. So you might not look at your water bill, but you do look at your electricity bill. Once you see the connections, you can start using less water more effectively in every single walk of life. So, all of a sudden, the utility and policymakers are in the position where they can be informed. We move on from living in a world of guesstimates. Instead of a dribble of data, think about data in petabytes. You have utilities which used to run on little morsels of data, already now having to deal with 500 million units of data a day. And you're creating loops of information because you know what's happening with that information, you know what matters, you get greater confidence in your information. People are becoming informed. 90% of water assets are underground. They're out of sight, out of mind. As a result, pipes are just repaired when you assume they break down. What about living in a world where you actually know what their real condition is? Doesn't matter if they're 200 years old, if they're still working. Repair them when they're needed to, repair them in the cheapest, most effective way, rather than a box-ticking exercise. So we become responsive. Then we can start predicting. There was a classic case last year when there were floods in northern England, and the Environment Agency said, well, our flood barriers all performed to expectation. The only problem was the water was 2 inches above. That's not good enough. You have to be able to model and predict to every eventuality. Nothing is fixed. Nothing is sacred. We are living in changing times, and climate change, attitude change, everything change. Being smart, being informed is about being able to respond to things. Save money, save power, save energy, become carbon neutral, become carbon positive. Wastewater treatment works, smartly run, actually generate energy, so they run their own pumps. There are opportunities everywhere. Smart irrigation, for example. One of the worst things you can do with crops is over-irrigate. So, if you actually need to put the amount of water it's actually needed through, for real time, through soil probes, not only do you save water, you improve yields. Across the world, the democracy of smart water. In India, you get villagers who, using a smartphone, they can send up information about sanitation instead of waiting for government inspectors to come and fill their own agendas. In Kenya, you have people paying their utility bills through smart apps instead of having to spend 3 hours going to a town to pay a bill. It works for everyone. So, when facts change, when we become informed, we can change. As I said earlier, there's very little in the way of disruptive technology, a big innovation. Smart water is not about big innovation. It's about the little things, putting the little things together in a holistic manner to create a great thing. It's about being positive, about being optimistic, that we can do things better for less money. How does it affect us personally? I think it's about taking that spirit, about making your message matter. It's taken me 10 years on one project to come to fruition. One of the reasons was I wasn't communicating it right. Another reason was the person there wasn't out there. Now it's happening. 10 years of waiting. Things happen. The patron saint of Wales, St. David, he was known as David the Waterman because he only drank water. Dŵr, water, do, dŵr, do. It's the same thing. It's all cyclical. Now, his last words were, Gwnewch a peth pethau bachyn mewn bywyd. Do the little things in life. Do the little things in life. That's what matters. It's about doing little things well. Each little thing well, knitted together, pushing together. Do those little things and you get a greater thing. Do those little things together and you get a great thing. That is the essence of being smart. That is the essence of digital disruption. Everyone here, you can do one thing. Do it. Leave this room with one positive thing. Together, those little positive things, no matter how grand, how humble, how idealistic, how pragmatic, those little things knit together. Leave this room, do the little things in life, and we together can do great things. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you.
So how about that? Before lunch, 2 new words. Shitocracy. Cretinocracy. Bridged by an oasis of loquaciousness. My word. But St. David, this thing about do the little things, is it's easy to say and sometimes harder to do. I was at an event a little while ago talking at an event for people who are specializing in marine renewables, so offshore wind, tidal power and stuff. 200 people or so in the audience. I said, how many people here have put their money where their mouth is and made sure that their pension is investing in the kind of jobs that they're trying to create? And now, in an audience where every single person's job depended on renewables, how many people in that room do you think had green pensions? 2 people. No one else had bothered to find out whether their money was aligned with their values, or what they were trying to make happen. And the little things could be as simple as understanding whether your money is doing the stuff so that when you're sleeping, it can do that work. And there's an amazing platform, if you haven't come across it, called Abundance Investments. And we worked out that there's £80 billion of pensions and ISAs in Wales that could go to fund the kind of projects that make this stuff happening. And I think for me, one of the most important small things that we can do is clear the space to allow those policymakers to do the stuff that really matters. Because without permission, it's too dangerous a space for them to step into. And so part of our job is like clearers of the minefields to do that, and recognizing that as we clear space, we can allow other people to follow safely in that way. And our next